Okay, this is the pre-lecture for Thursday. It's Wednesday about noon, so I'll post this up as soon as I can. Sorry for the late posting. So this is focusing on the where of conservation. So Matt and Ryan yesterday talked about connectivity and how you might use things like CircuitScape to um, design protected areas or protections for areas, and that jumps ahead a bit from the corridor and fragmentation literature and into a particular brand of thinking about building protections in. So I'm going to also go back a little bit and think about moving from opportunism to scorecards to gap analysis to thinking about things like complementarity and systematic conservation planning, put conservation by design into perspective, and then onto Marxan and zonation. And I'm going to try and introduce these things today, and we'll get a little deeper into them on Thursday and look at some case studies and the like. So here we go. So what's the problem? The problem is that we have a limited budget for conservation, and that conservation is a big problem. So we want efficient solutions on where we protect stuff. And as a consequence, many strategies have emerged. Some of them aren't very much of strategies, but they're strategies nonetheless. The Nature Conservancy could be characterized as having begun by just basically taking what land people gave them or bequeathed to them or sold them at a cheap price, and that we could characterize as raw opportunism. They moved from that onto something that we call conservation scorecards, where they were using the Natural Heritage Database data. They started the Natural Heritage Database data specifically for this, and they were tallying species. This is the 70s and 80s, and at this point they are the world leader in private NGO conservation in doing stuff. And in many ways they remain. They're the largest land trust, global land trust in the world, and probably have the largest science staff of any conservation organization, and invests more in figuring out how we should do stuff than any other organization. With a brief hiatus in there when Conservation International actually owned that, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But that's history, not biology. And then World Wildlife Fund and others did hotspots analysis. They took these scorecards and said, well, if we can tally how many different things are in sites that we are considering to purchase or protect, could we also just simply look at the maps of those tallied species and think about where on Earth we should be focusing? And this was a particularly effective thing for international conservation NGOs, because they were really looking at where they might work around the world. Less effective for individual countries because Canada might only care about hotspots of diversity within Canada, and so global hotspot analysis didn't mean much to them. And any country should be more or less like that, I guess. Then gap analysis. I think I mentioned gap analysis earlier. It's something that came up in the United States through the U.S. Geological Survey. Mike Scott, who's a big name in Endangered Species Act. But basically the idea is, if you have these maps of tallied species, can you overlay a map of protected areas and find the gaps between the maps and those tallied species to figure out where you should be working? And this is all very science-y kinds of things. On the other end, conservation by design was a set of strategies and techniques or tools that the Nature Conservancy would use to implement basically the ideas that are listed above. And then there's been landscape species protections organizations like Wildlife Conservation Society and World Wildlife Fund, who think about some of these big landscape species, elephants and wildebeest and things like this, and how that might move between protected areas, and how you help develop protections for all of those. Important bird areas is an example of that. And within that context, scientists have been playing along and trying to figure out how to most efficiently do conservation, and up came systematic conservation planning. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that today. But it's also worthwhile thinking about this as a federal problem, that lacking a federal Habitat Protection Act, other strategies have emerged, and many of them use the Endangered Species Act to implement protections for habitats. So habitat conservation plans, for example, are a way of setting aside protections for habitats based on endangered species and their need for habitats. California, California has a thing called Community Conservation Planning (NCCPs) that have been very effective as county planning tools to help integrate conservation strategies. Land trusts, easement, mitigation strategies, these are all part of the way that we in the U.S. operate through public entities to try and increase protections to nature, and as well as open space bonds. There's a lot of bonds that are billed. Proposition 1 passed in California, and it has created a lot of funding to protect open space, and the California AB 32 provides carbon mitigation dollars, and some of those are going to protect habitats. And so the main challenge is funds to protect, but one of the main challenges we have then is that there are these opportunities like bonds and mitigation dollars that create funds to protect something, but not necessarily funds to manage. And Florida had a problem with that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So a lot of academics have looked at these overarching strategies. Kent Redford in 2003 identifies utilitarian and intrinsic values. We've talked about that before, and distinguishes the where to do conservation from the how to do conservation, and evaluated approaches by 13 different conservation organizations to look at the spectrum of things going on. Several other proposals moved from the 80s or early 90s up to the 2000s on this. Pressey et al. Wrote a paper, Beyond Opportunism, Key Principles for Systematic Reserve Selection, and this is really the launching of systematic conservation planning. Simberloff and others around the turn of the century were looking at indicators as ways of developing priorities for places to preserve, or looking at these flagship species like lions and things like that, and asks, is single species management passé? Mike Scott, Nature Reserves, do they capture biodiversity? Margulis and Pressey, really formalized systematic conservation planning. Nick Solavsky, who founds the Foundation of Success and drives the open standards, writes something called Improving the Practice of Conservation. Groves et al., Craig Groves, the Nature Conservancy Planning, writes a book, Planning for Conservation Practice. So there's a lot of effort right here in this period of time, thinking about how to do a better job of arguing why we're setting aside what we're setting aside. And then I should mention that Craig Groves and Eddie Game, both of the Nature Conservancy, issued a book just this last month or two called Conservation Planning, Informed Decisions for a Healthier Planet. And again, where they're using a lot of this open standards and structured decision-making sorts of approaches to conservation. So this table from Kent Redford, organizational mission and drives, and then talks about different different organizations and how they're focusing on their conservation. So English Nature, there's one in the middle that's sort of simple. Their mission is to the conservation of wildlife and natural features throughout England, and they're focusing on natural areas and biodiversity action plans. They have a where strategy and a how strategy, and that they have scale at which they're working. And so this is an interesting set of things to think about, because it really makes you think about how organizations are both thinking about how they do things and where they do them. So Craig Groves wrote this book, Conservation by Design, and had identified 7 key steps for doing conservation. Identify the targets, collect and identify information gaps, establish conservation goals, assess the existing conservation areas, evaluate the ability of the targets to persist, assemble a portfolio of areas, and then do stuff. Now, this should look very much like this open standards approach of identifying targets, setting objectives for those targets, identifying the threats, and then actions that you might do that we're trying to work through with our case studies. And they emerge from the same place. They are very similar. But I have in here under number 6, Mark's hand, which turned out to be a PhD thesis in, guess what, 2000, where it identified site selection algorithms and used biogeographic principles to think about strategic ways to identify sets of things to protect. And we'll get to that in detail later. So, but all these things recognize that there's information limitations, and so Caro and O'Doherty 99 look at surrogates for biodiversity and how well indicators, flagships, and these sorts of things might do at protecting landscapes. Some things take a long time to move forward and actually come through to the literature. Etting et al. In 2006 reported on Florida's F-track approach. Well, Florida was a leading natural heritage program, and they really fine-tuned the means of using scorecards to try and prioritize sites that they were interested in. And then they had a fortuitous thing happen, is that a bond or a bill or some piece of legislation passed in Florida where land sales carried with it a tax that went into a pool of funds that was for protecting open space. The idea was, if there's a lot of development pressure in Florida, some of that should benefit open space, and so you just tax the purchase of land that often resulted in land conversion. And this created $1 billion a year or something to buy land for conservation. And so they went through a process of vastly increasing the amount of public lands they had for conservation. Well, so how did they do? This is where they looked at their outcomes, and the gray areas are conservation lands, and black are the F-track portfolio as of 2000, or the proposed 2010 portfolio. This was a 2006 paper. But basically, they can the graph on the left, they can look at the optimal acquisition and what they actually did in the gray, and potential future acquisition. They feel like they did very well in species. It was a species or scorecard approach. A little less well in communities and watersheds. But it basically was this just tally them and pick the best thing that you got on the list from a list. And there's an obvious problem with that, is that you can get areas that have lots of species, but they might have lots of the same species, and therefore you don't ever get some species because they are found in areas that where not many other things that you're interested in are found, and so it can fall by the wayside. And so we have better methods than that now. Just as an aside, one of the other things that is at play here is Stephen Pulaski and Blair Tsudi and a bunch of others have been thinking about these trade-offs between different kinds of land uses. And a lot of what the conservation organizations were doing up to this point, and even into maybe up to 5 years ago, is really thinking about conservation as their only priority, and that if we had envision conservation as having a direct negative trade-off with development, we might expect a line that goes straight from this point H to the point A, where you would get the more income you get from land and billions of dollars, the economic return from how you use land would trade off directly and linearly with the attributes of nature that you value. And they were arguing that actually smarter conservation can think about how you spatially place conservation efforts, and you might have these efficiency frontiers where you have G, F, E, D, B, C, C, and B, where you can gain most of your economic return from the landscape and retain most of the species. And so they argue that this is a good way to think about it. Now, point I should say, is really where the landscape is now. It's not. It does fall along the line between H and A, and doesn't get very close to the efficiency frontiers. And there's a lot of hefty assumptions in here, but still the point remains that there's probably some way to optimize the balance between productive land use management and conservation to try and jointly maximize those two entities. And we'll talk a bit about that toward the end of class on Thursday. So about the same time as F-track was reporting on how they did, and Pulaski's reporting on these efficiency frontiers, Andrew Knight, who's now at Imperial College, who's at the time in South Africa, wrote a couple papers, Knowing But Not Doing, Selecting Priority Conservation Areas in the Research Implementation Gap. And he noted a lot of things, but that even, despite the fact that we spend a lot of time and energy collecting all this information about where things are, turns out we often don't do those things, and that we do other things. And his argument is often that this is because we have somehow assumed that biological priorities are going to win the day, and we ought to be paying more attention to the social situation, that sociological priorities